The sun over the Arizona territory was not a nurturing star, but a judgment. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue and baked the land until it cracked like old pottery. Heat shimmered above the canyons, distorting the shapes of skeletal saguaros that stood with their arms raised in permanent surrender. The wind was a dry, rasping thing, a constant whisper that carried dust and the scent of sun-scorched creosote. It howled through the crags and over the ridges, a lonely sound in a land that had little use for softness. Along one of these ridges, a man moved with a silence that belonged to the predators of this place. Caton was a ghost in the shimmering air, his moccasins making no sound on the broken rock. His body was lean and hard, honed by the landscape itself. His eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. They swept over the vast expanse below, noting the way the dust settled, the distant, unnatural line of a settler's fence, the slow circling of a vulture far to the south. He was scouting, a sentinel for his people, watching the slow, steady encroachment of the world that was not his. There was a tension in the air, a sickness that had seeped into the ground with the settlers' wells and the iron rails. Danger was no longer just the fang of a rattlesnake or the claw of a mountain lion. It was the whisper on the wind, the glint of a rifle barrel, the hard, unseeing eyes of the men who called this land their own. Miles away, nestled in a green bend of the San Pedro River, the Beckwith ranch house stood as a monument to that encroachment. It was a sturdy, two-story structure of river stone and timber, an arrogant declaration of permanence in a world that offered none. Inside its cool, dim walls, another kind of silence reigned, thick with unspoken rules and resentments. Here, Clara moved with a quietness that rivaled Caton's, though hers was born not of skill but of fear. She was a slight thing, with hair the color of dried corn silk and eyes that were often fixed on the floorboards. Her hands, though chapped and reddened from lye soap and scalding water, were perpetually busy. She polished silver that was never used, dusted furniture that no one sat on, and swept floors only to watch the ever-present dust settle again. Her existence was a series of quiet, repetitive tasks performed under the watchful, unblinking gaze of Mrs. Beckwith. The widow was a woman carved from the same hard material as the land she now commanded. Her husband had broken the soil, but she had inherited its spirit of unforgiving dominion. Grief had not softened her. It had calcified her, leaving a core of bitter steel. She saw Clara not as a person, but as a component of the household, less valuable than the Hereford cattle in the fields, and more troublesome than the aging hound that slept on the porch. Clara was a possession, and a shameful one at that. She had arrived 2 years prior, an orphan sent west by a distant charity, and Mrs. Beckwith had never let her forget it. Every meal Clara ate was a debt. Every night she slept under that roof an act of charity that could be revoked at any moment. The widow's cruelty was not always in her words, which were sharp enough, but in the cold, dismissive weight of her silence. It was in the way she would watch Clara work, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, as if the girl's very presence was an offense. Clara had learned to make herself small, to move through the house like a phantom. She learned the specific creak of the floorboard outside Mrs. Beckwith's room, the sound of the widow's heavy footsteps, the sharp intake of breath that signaled an impending reprimand. But there was a threat in the house far worse than the widow's cold tyranny. Elias, the widow's son, was a man cast in his father's physical mold but possessing none of his fortitude. He was broad-shouldered and handsome in a coarse, fleshy way, with a perpetual sneer that soured his features. Where his father had built an empire with grit, Elias seemed intent on drinking it away. He moved with a restless, angry energy, his boots loud on the polished floors, his voice a constant disruption to the house's fragile quiet. And he watched Clara. He watched her when she served dinner, his eyes lingering on her neck, her hands. He watched her when she hung laundry in the yard, his gaze a physical weight that made her skin crawl. Mrs. Beckwith saw it. Of course, she saw everything, but she said nothing, her silence a form of complicity. Perhaps she believed it was Clara's place to endure it, another part of her servitude. The memory of what he had done was a scar that time refused to heal. It lived under Clara's skin, a constant, low thrum of terror. It had been a sweltering night a month ago. Elias, reeking of whiskey and rage after a losing night of cards in town, had cornered her in the pantry. His breath had been hot on her face, his words slurred and ugly. She had fought, a desperate, silent struggle among the sacks of flour and jars of preserves. His hand had clamped over her mouth, his other hand tearing at the collar of her dress. The only thing that had saved her was the sound of his mother's voice calling his name from the parlor. Sharp and impatient, he had shoved her back against the shelves, hard, rattling the jars around her, before stumbling out. She had been left trembling in the dark, the scent of spilled whiskey and fear clinging to her clothes. A deep, ugly bruise had blossomed on her cheekbone, and another on her arm, where his fingers had dug into her flesh. When Mrs. Beckwith saw the marks the next morning, she had simply stared, her face a mask of cold fury. "You will learn to be more careful," she had said, her voice like ice. "Do not provoke him." The blame, swift and absolute, had settled on Clara. From that day on, the house was no longer just a place of servitude. It was a cage with a predator inside, and she was the bait. Clara bore the secret like a physical weight, her shame as vivid as the faint yellowing of the bruise she tried to hide with her hair. Outside the strained silence of the ranch, the world was growing louder. Whispers that had started in the saloons and mercantile stores had grown into open talk of war. Apache raids, they said. Cattle stolen. A prospector found dead near the Dragoon Mountains. The stories grew with each telling, fear twisting rumor into fact. Hostility curdled the air in the nearby town of Verde Crossing. Men who had once traded peacefully with the local tribes now spat on the ground when they saw them. Their faces were hard, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Soldiers from the fort rode through the territory with a rough, swaggering authority. They were young men, mostly, far from home and fueled by cheap whiskey and a simmering resentment for the land and its native people. They saw no difference between the peaceful Chiricahua, who farmed small plots near the river, and the warrior bands who raided from the mountains. To them, all were savages, obstacles to be cleared. Caton and his people saw the patrols, saw the hardening of the settlers' faces. They knew this was a peace that could not hold. It was a dying thing, gasping its last breath in the blistering Arizona heat. Mrs. Beckwith, for all her pride, was not immune to the growing fear. Her cattle represented her wealth, her standing, her entire world. The thought of losing them to raiders gnawed at her. But she was a pragmatic woman. She would not rely on the scattered and unreliable protection of the army. She would make her own arrangements. She sent for a man named Silas Kane, a wiry, sun-weathered man of mixed blood who moved between the two worlds. He was a trader, a messenger, an opportunist who profited from the friction between the cultures. He arrived one afternoon, tying his scrawny horse to the rail and accepting a glass of water from Clara on the porch without ever meeting her eyes. He and the widow spoke for a long time in the parlor, their voices a low murmur that did not carry past the closed doors. Clara, dusting in the hall, could only catch fragments. "3 of my best geldings," Mrs. Beckwith was saying. "Assurance. Your man, Caton. He leads the raids." Silas's voice was lower, gravelly. "He leads the warriors. He keeps the peace, if the peace is kept with him." There was a long pause. When Mrs. Beckwith spoke again, her voice was stripped of all emotion, as flat and final as a deed of sale. "I will add a token of goodwill, a gesture of my sincerity." Clara moved away from the door, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. She did not know what the words meant, but the tone sent a shiver down her spine. Later that evening, Mrs. Beckwith summoned her to the parlor. Elias was there, slumped in a chair, a half-empty bottle on the table beside him. He looked at Clara with a smug, triumphant curl to his lip. "You will be leaving us, Clara," Mrs. Beckwith said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not sound pleased or sorry, merely factual. "Arrangements have been made. You will be accompanying Mr. Kane in the morning. Pack nothing." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Leaving? Where am I going?" "That is not your concern," the widow said. "You are part of a bargain to ensure the safety of this ranch. You should be grateful to serve such a purpose." Elias snorted into his glass. "Going to live with the savages? Clara, maybe you'll find one of them to your liking." The room tilted. The air grew thin. Clara looked from Elias's leering face to his mother's impassive one. She was not being sent away. She was being sold, or worse, given a token. A piece of property traded for other property. The flour sacks in the pantry, the jars of preserves, the horses in the field, and her, all items to be bartered. The unspoken truth of her existence in this house was now laid bare. She was worthless, and therefore she was disposable. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive. Silas Kane was waiting by the corral. The 3 horses' misses. Beckwith had promised already saddled and tied. He did not speak to Clara as she approached, only gestured with his head for her to follow. She did not look back at the house. There was nothing there for her. No one stood on the porch to see her off. It was as if she were already a ghost. They rode for hours, away from the river and deep into the harsh, broken country of the foothills. The land grew wilder, the trail thinning to little more than a deer path winding through mesquite and thorny acacia. Silas rode ahead, a grim, silent figure. Clara followed, her mind a numb landscape of terror. She thought of stories she had heard in town, brutal tales of what Apache warriors did to white women. Elias's sneering face swam in her vision. This was his doing, his and his mother's. This was her punishment for being cornered in the pantry, for not submitting, for being an inconvenience. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red, Silas stopped. They were in a small, enclosed canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. The air was still and heavy. "Get down," he ordered. Clara's legs trembled as she slid from the horse. Her whole body was shaking, a tremor that started deep inside her and worked its way out to her fingertips. "He will be here soon," Silas said, avoiding her gaze. He took the reins of her horse and the 3 geldings. "This is where I leave you." He turned without another word and led the horses back the way they had come, his form quickly swallowed by the deepening shadows. She was alone. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, fragile figure against the immense, indifferent stone. She thought about running. But where? The desert stretched for miles in every direction, an enemy as certain as the one she was waiting for. There was no escape. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The last light bled from the sky, and the world was reduced to shades of gray and black. Then he was there. He did not emerge from the rocks. He simply materialized from the shadows, as if he were a part of them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette a stark, intimidating shape against the fading light. He moved toward her with that same unnerving silence she had seen in the desert predators. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the sharp planes of his face, the dark intensity of his eyes. This was him, Caton. Her mind emptied of everything but a raw, primal fear. The stories, the whispers, Elias's taunts, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying certainty. This was the end. Her body, her life, was no longer her own. All she had left was one last, desperate plea, not for mercy, but for a swift conclusion. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. The trembling became a violent shudder. Her voice, when it came, was a choked, broken thing, barely audible in the vast silence of the canyon. "Please," she whispered, the word tearing from her throat. "Please, make it quick." She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the brutal impact, for the pain that was sure to come. She waited and waited. Nothing happened. There was no sound, no movement. Cautiously, she opened her eyes. Kaiten had not moved, but the look on his face had changed. The hard, impassive mask of the warrior had faltered. He was staring at her, but not with lust or contempt. There was something else in his eyes, a flicker of stunned recognition, of profound sorrow. His gaze dropped from her face to her arm, where the sleeve of her dress had ridden up, revealing the faint, yellowing traces of the bruises Elias had left. He saw, in the dim light, he saw the marks of a violence that had already been done to her. He saw the terror in her eyes, heard the utter despair in her voice. He saw not a defiant settler, not a token to be claimed, but a broken, terrified creature who expected only more pain. He took a slow step back, as if her fear were a physical force pushing him away. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, he turned and walked over to his horse, which stood tethered in the deeper shadows. He returned with a waterskin and a heavy wool blanket. He set the waterskin on the ground near her feet. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unfolded the blanket and gently draped it over her shaking shoulders. His fingers did not touch her. The wool was coarse and warm, smelling of wood smoke and sage. The simple weight of it was a shock, an impossible comfort in a moment of absolute terror. He looked at her one last time, his dark eyes holding hers for a heart-stopping second. There was a universe of unspoken things in that gaze. Pity, anger, a deep, weary sadness. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the shadows, his footsteps making no sound on the rocky ground. Clara stood frozen, the heavy blanket wrapped around her, the water skin at her feet. She listened until she could no longer hear the faint sound of his horse moving away. She was alone again, but everything had changed. The night was still cold, the canyon still menacing, her future still a terrifying unknown. But she was untouched, in a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty and indifference. A man she had expected to be a monster had shown her a moment of incomprehensible kindness. The tears still fell, but now they were born not just of fear, but of a stunned, fragile, and utterly bewildering spark of hope. The first light of dawn was a thin, gray wash over the eastern mountains when Clara awoke. For a moment, she was suspended in the soft, disoriented space between sleep and waking, aware only of a strange warmth against the chill of the air. She was cocooned in coarse wool, the scent of sage and smoke a comforting presence in the darkness. Then memory returned, a brutal, icy plunge. The canyon, the silent warrior, her own pathetic plea. She sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. She was alone. The rock walls of the canyon were etched in sharp relief against the growing light. The water skin lay beside her, untouched. A profound stillness had settled over the place, as if the tense encounter of the night before had been a dream. But the blanket was real, its solid weight a testament to the inexplicable mercy she had been shown. He had left her, unharmed. A wave of humiliation, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. She had been offered up like a broodmare, a peace offering to a savage, and he had rejected her. He had looked at her bruises and her terror, and found her so pitiful that he had simply walked away. The shame was a physical ache, sharper than any blow. Yet, beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of something else took root. He had not hurt her. He had covered her against the cold and left her water. It made no sense. Clara pushed the blanket aside, a sudden urgency seizing her. She had to get back. Back to what? She did not know. The cage was still a cage, the predator still a predator, but the wilderness was a more certain death. She drank deeply from the water skin, the cool liquid a shock to her dry throat. And then she started walking, following the faint trail Silas Kane had made hours before. The journey back was an agony. The rising sun was relentless, beating down on her head. Her thin shoes, not meant for such terrain, were quickly shredded by the sharp rocks and thorny brush. Thirst returned, a burning in the back of her throat. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle in the scrub, a snake or something worse. But the fear that propelled her was not of the desert. It was the fear of the known, of the cold, quiet house by the river and the contemptuous eyes of the people within it. It was mid-morning when she finally saw the dusty track that passed for a road to Verde Crossing. She looked a frightful sight. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt, her hair a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with dust and dried tears. She limped toward the first buildings of the town, a collection of tired-looking structures baking in the sun. Her first encounter was with Mr. Henderson, the owner of the mercantile. He was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store when he saw her. His eyes widened, first in shock, then in a kind of prurient curiosity. He stopped sweeping and simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. A woman who passed by, clutching her Bible, gasped and hurried on, pulling her child close. The judgment was instantaneous, a palpable wave of condemnation that washed over Clara before a single word had been spoken. She kept her head down, her focus on putting one foot in front of the other. Her destination, the long, dusty road that led to the Beckwith Ranch. She had nearly passed the saloon when the doors swung open and a figure blocked her path. Elias. He was not yet drunk, but he was on his way, his eyes holding the mean, glassy sheen she knew so well. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face as he took in her disheveled appearance. Well, he said, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. Look what the cat dragged in. Or should I say, what the Apache let go. A few men loitering near the saloon turned to watch, their faces eager for the spectacle. Clara tried to step around him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Have a good time out in the hills, Clara? Elias drawled, moving to block her again. Did you learn any new tricks? I hear they're not too gentle. His words were like stones, each one a sharp, painful blow. Clara's face burned with shame. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, dissecting her, imagining all the brutal things that had been done to her. They did not see a survivor. They saw a stain. Leave me alone, Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. Oh, I'll leave you alone, he sneered, leaning closer. Seems you've had enough company for one night. Mother was right. You're nothing but trouble. Tainted goods. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and stepped aside, making a grand, mocking bow. As she hurried past, her body rigid with humiliation, she heard him call after her. Don't you worry, we'll find some other way to pay for our peace. The long walk to the ranch was a blur of dust and shame. When she finally stumbled up the path to the house, Mrs. Beckwith was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. She looked Clara up and down, her lip curling in disgust. So, he sent you back, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I suppose even a savage has his standards. Get inside, and for heaven's sake, make yourself presentable. You are a disgrace to this house. There were no questions about what had happened, no hint of concern. There was only anger that the bargain had failed, that the token had been returned, that the problem was once again hers to deal with. In the days that followed, the ranch house became a prison more complete than it had ever been. Clara was confined, forbidden from going into town, forbidden even from hanging laundry in the yard. She worked from sunup to sundown, scrubbing floors until her knees were raw, polishing silver until her fingers ached, all under the suffocating weight of the widow's silent disapproval. Elias would pass her in the halls and make a low, guttural noise in his throat, a sound of pure disgust. The house was no longer just a place of fear. It was a tomb where she was being buried alive, inch by inch, day by day. One evening, after she had served a dinner that Elias and his mother ate in stony silence, Mrs. Beckwith called her into the parlor. "I have made arrangements," the widow announced, not looking at Clara but at the fire crackling in the hearth. "My cousin in Prescott is in need of a girl. It is a booming town. No one there will know you. No one will ask questions about where you have been." The words were meant to sound like a solution, but to Clara, they sounded like a death sentence, to be sent away again, to another town, another house, another life of servitude. But this time with the indelible stain of scandal clinging to her. She would forever be the girl who had spent a night with the Apache, the girl whose story was too shameful to be told. She would never be free. "You will leave on the Friday stage," Mrs. Beckwith concluded, a note of finality in her voice. "I have already paid your passage. I trust you will not cause any more trouble." Clara stood motionless, the widow's words echoing in the silent room. Something inside her, something that had been dormant for years, a small, resilient core of self that had survived everything, finally broke. She would not go. She would not be passed from one cage to another like an unwanted animal. She would rather die in the desert on her own terms than let them ship her off to be buried again. That night, she lay awake in her small, stuffy room under the eaves, listening to the house settle. She listened to the grandfather clock in the hall chime 11, then 12. She waited until the silence was deep and absolute, until the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. Then she rose. She did not take anything with her. There was nothing in this house that belonged to her, nothing she wanted to remember. She crept down the narrow servants' stairs, her bare feet silent on the worn wood. Each creak of the old house was a thunderclap in her ears. She held her breath as she passed the parlor, her body tensing at the thought of Elias slumped in a chair, or the widow sleepless in her room. But the house was still. The back door was her escape. She fumbled with the bolt, her fingers clumsy with fear. It slid back with a soft, metallic click that sounded as loud as a gunshot. She slipped outside into the cool night air. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. She did not look back. She ran. She ran from the perfectly manicured lawn onto the rough dirt of the ranch road. She ran until her lungs burned and her side ached. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she was running away. Away from the cold eyes of the widow. Away from the leering smile of her son. Away from the whispers and the stares and the suffocating weight of their world. She ran toward the dark, formidable silhouette of the mountains, toward the unknown. For Caton, the return to his people had been a somber one. The image of the girl in the canyon was burned into his mind. Her pale, tear-streaked face, the tremor in her voice, the dark marks on her skin. She had been offered to him like a piece of meat, a symbol of the settlers' contempt. They thought his people were animals, that they could be bought off with horses and a woman. The insult was deep. But his reaction had not been one of anger alone. It had been something more complicated, something that disturbed the quiet certainty of his world. He had seen her not as a white woman, an enemy, but as a person, terrified and in pain. And he had walked away. He found his camp in the hidden canyon where they had spent the season. His sister, Nolly, was tending the fire, her movements efficient and graceful. She was younger than him, but she had the eyes of an old soul, perceptive and knowing. She looked up as he approached, and her smile faded as she saw the look on his face. "You found trouble," she said. It was not a question. "The settlers are afraid," Caton said, dismounting and stripping the saddle from his horse. "They offer gifts to keep us away." He did not mention the girl. He could not bring himself to speak of it, to put the shame of that transaction into words. But Nolly saw the shadow in his eyes. In the days that followed, she watched him. He was quiet, more so than usual. He would stare into the fire for hours, his thoughts miles away. He was restless, his warrior's focus blunted by a distraction he could not name. "Your spirit is not here, my brother," she said to him one evening as they sat watching the stars emerge. "It is back there, with the white eyes." Caton did not deny it. "They tried to trade a girl for peace," he said, his voice low and tight, as if she were a horse. "She was afraid. She thought I would—" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. Nali placed a hand on his arm. "You did not harm her." Again, it was not a question. She knew her brother. "No," he said. "I left her." But the decision did not sit well with him. It felt incomplete, an unresolved chord in the song of his life. To have left her to the mercy of the people who had offered her up in the first place felt like a different kind of cruelty. 2 days later, he was tracking a small herd of deer that had moved down from the high country. The trail led him east, toward the lands that bordered the settler territories. The sun was hot, the air still. He moved with the patient, focused rhythm of the hunter, his mind on the task. The tracks led him toward a dry creek bed, a sandy wash fringed with brittle, sun-bleached cottonwoods. And then he saw it, a splash of pale color against the brown earth. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. It was a person, lying face down in the sand. As he drew closer, his heart gave a hard, painful jolt. He recognized the faded blue of the dress, the corn silk hair, now matted with dirt and leaves. It was her, the girl from the canyon. She was utterly still. For a terrible moment, he thought she was dead. He knelt beside her, his movements slow. Her skin was dry and hot to the touch, her lips cracked and bleeding. He saw the soles of her feet. They were a raw, bloody mess of cuts and blisters. She had been walking for a long time. He gently turned her over. A faint, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She was alive, but barely. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken into dark hollows. She was burning with fever. He looked around. There were no tracks but hers. She had come here alone, on foot, from the direction of the ranch. She had been running. He hesitated. A war raged within him. To help her was to invite disaster. A white woman in their camp would bring the soldiers, would bring death and destruction. His duty, his sole purpose, was to protect his people. To leave her here was the logical choice. It was the safe choice. She was not his responsibility. But he could not do it. He could not leave her to die. He looked at her battered feet, at her feverish, unconscious face. He remembered the sound of her voice in the canyon, the utter despair in her whispered plea. She was not an enemy. She was a survivor, just like his own people, fighting for her life in a world that wanted to crush her. With a sigh that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul, he made his choice. He carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and desperation. He lifted her as gently as he could and began the long walk back to his camp, her head resting against his shoulder, her fate now irrevocably tied to his. When he arrived, the camp fell silent. The women stopped their work, their faces hardening as they saw the white girl in his arms. Children, who had been playing, ran to hide behind their mothers' skirts. The men gathered, their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. This was the enemy, brought into the heart of their sanctuary. Nali was the first to move. She came forward, her eyes wide as she took in the girl's pathetic state. She looked from Clara's unconscious face to her brother's grim, determined one. "She will die if we do nothing," Caton said, his voice low but firm, a challenge to any who might object. The women murmured amongst themselves, their voices sharp with fear and distrust. "The soldiers will come," one said. "She will bring them down on us." "She is one of them," another spat. "Let the desert take her." Nali ignored them. She reached out and touched Clara's forehead, her expression softening with pity. "She is burning," she said. She looked at her brother, then at the wary faces around her. "She is a woman, alone and hurt. Are we not Apache? Do we leave the helpless to die?" Her words shamed them into silence. Nale led the way to her wickiup, a small, dome-shaped shelter made of brush and hides. Caton laid Clara down gently on a bed of soft furs. For days, Nale did not leave her side. She bathed Clara's face with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea between her cracked lips to fight the fever, and treated her wounded feet with a poultice of herbs. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fevered haze of nightmarish images. She was back in the pantry with Elias, his hot breath on her face. She was running through an endless thorny desert, her feet bleeding. She was standing in the canyon, whispering her plea to a shadowy figure. Slowly, very slowly, the fever broke. One afternoon, she opened her eyes and saw not the stuffy ceiling of her attic room, but a curved roof of woven branches. The air smelled of wood smoke and unfamiliar herbs. A young woman with kind, dark eyes was sitting beside her, grinding corn on a flat stone. It was Nale. She smiled when she saw Clara was awake. In the days that followed, Clara's strength began to return. She was weak and her feet were still tender, but she could sit up, then stand, then walk. The Apache people watched her with a wary distance, but Nale's protection was absolute. She gave Clara a simple deerskin dress to replace her tattered clothes and shared her food without question. Clara began to help. At first, it was small things. She would fetch water from the spring that trickled from the canyon wall or help gather firewood. Then, Nale showed her how to grind corn, her own clumsy movements a stark contrast to the effortless, rhythmic grace of the other women. They still did not speak to her, but they no longer turned their backs when she approached. They simply made room for her at the grinding stone. She spent the evening sitting near the communal fire, listening. She did not understand the words, the soft, flowing sounds of the Apache language, but she understood the tone. She heard the gentle cadence of mothers humming to their children, the low, serious talk of the men, the eruption of shared laughter at a story well told. One night, an old woman was telling a story, her voice animated, her hands painting pictures in the firelight. The people around her were captivated. At one point, she made a funny, guttural noise and a sweeping gesture, and the whole camp burst into laughter. The sound was so warm, so genuine, that Clara felt a smile touch her own lips. Then, a small, unfamiliar sound escaped her, a quiet chuckle. It grew into a soft, full laugh. The sound startled her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed. It felt like a lifetime ago. Heads turned in her direction. Caton, who had been watching her from the shadows, saw the look of surprise on her face, the way her eyes lit up with a light he had never seen before. In this hidden canyon, surrounded by people she should have feared, the girl who had forgotten how to laugh was slowly, impossibly, beginning to heal. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, dictated by the sun and the simple, necessary tasks of survival. Clara found a strange peace in the routine. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew calloused from grinding corn and gathering wood. The sun browned her skin, and the clean, dry air filled her lungs, chasing out the last of the stale, oppressive atmosphere of the Beckwith house. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long began to recede, replaced by a watchful, cautious curiosity. Her evenings were spent by the main fire, a silent observer on the edge of the circle. Caton was often there, his presence a steady, quiet weight in the flickering light. They rarely spoke, but a language of silence grew between them. It was a comfortable quiet, one that did not demand answers or explanations. Sometimes, their eyes would meet across the flames, and in those brief moments, an unspoken understanding passed between them. He was as watchful of her as she was of him. One night, when the sky was a vast, dark blanket pricked with 1,000 points of diamond-hard light, he spoke to her. The rest of the camp had settled into their wickiups, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. "You see the 3 stars in a line?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the stillness. He pointed toward the heavens. "That is Yo, the porcupine. He is climbing a tree." Clara followed his gaze. She had seen those stars 100 times before, but had never truly looked at them. "We call it a belt," she said softly. "Part of a hunter." He nodded slowly. "Our stories are in the stars. They tell us where we come from and where we are going." Over the next hour, he traced the constellations for her, giving them names that were like music. Hasheshi, the fire god; Nahukos, the revolving male, and telling her the ancient stories that went with them. He was not just showing her stars. He was opening a door to his world, a world of deep connection to the land and the sky. In return, she offered him a small, broken piece of her own world. "I was born near a river," she told him one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "The Mississippi. It was not like the river here. It was wide and brown and slow, so big you could not see the other side in the morning mist. It was always moving, always going somewhere." She spoke of the thick, humid air, the scent of wet earth and honeysuckle, the sound of steamships calling in the fog. It was a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, a dream she had once had. Telling him about it made it feel real again, a part of her that had not been erased. Their quiet communion did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as Caetan was refletching arrows near his wickiup, an elder named Chato approached him. Chato's face was a map of wrinkles, his eyes holding the wisdom and sorrow of 100 seasons. He had been the one to argue most strongly against Clara's presence. "The girl grows stronger," Chato said, his voice dry as a seed pod. Caetan grunted in assent, not looking up from his work. "She has a white woman's face. It is a face that brings soldiers," the old man continued, his tone sharp with warning. "They will not stop looking for her. When they find her here, they will see an excuse to do what they have always wanted to do. They will burn us from this canyon." Caetan's hands stilled. He knew the elder was right. Every day she stayed, the risk grew. He was the warrior leader, responsible for the safety of these people, the women, the children, the very elders who now questioned his judgment. His duty was clear. He should send her away, point her toward the nearest fort, and let her people deal with her. "She would not survive a day in the desert alone," Caetan said, his voice flat. "That is her fate, not ours," Chato countered. "You brought a stray coyote into the camp. It may seem tame, but it will eventually lead the pack to our door. You are letting your heart cloud your mind. Caetan, it is a weakness our enemies will exploit." The old man's words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Caetan remained silent, his jaw tight. He was torn between the deep, ingrained duty to his people and a new, unsettling sense of duty to the wounded girl who laughed in her sleep. He watched Chato walk away, the weight of the elder's warning settling heavily in his chest. But when he looked over and saw Clara sitting with Nali, her head bent as she tried to master the intricate weave of a basket, he knew he could not turn her out. Not yet. Clara, unaware of the debate that surrounded her, found her world slowly expanding. The camp, which had at first seemed a terrifying and alien place, was revealing itself to be a community bound by threads of resilience and care. Her perception of Caetan, the man she had first seen as a fearsome executioner, was undergoing a profound transformation. She saw him not just as a warrior, but as a man. She watched him with his horse, a powerful black stallion that was as wild and proud as the landscape. With everyone else, the horse was skittish and ill-tempered, but with Caetan, it was as gentle as a foal. He would speak to it in low, soothing tones, his hands moving over its powerful muscles with a familiarity that was both tender and commanding. He tended to the animal's needs before his own, a display of quiet responsibility that touched a place deep inside her. One afternoon, a scream ripped through the camp. A small boy, no older than 5, had been playing near a woodpile and had disturbed a rattlesnake. The snake was coiled, its tail a furious blur, its head drawn back to strike, before anyone could move. Caton was there. He moved with a speed that was breathtaking. Placing himself between the terrified child and the angry serpent, he did not kill the snake. With a long, forked stick, he pinned its head, then calmly picked it up and carried it far out into the brush, releasing it back into its own world. He returned to the boy, who was sobbing in his mother's arms, and knelt before him, speaking soft words until the child's tears subsided. Clara watched, her heart in her throat. He had not hesitated. He had protected the child without a thought for his own safety. A week later, a sickness swept through the camp, and the wife of one of the hunters died. The woman's grief-stricken cry echoed through the canyon, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. Clara saw Caton go to the grieving mother, who was sitting outside her wickiup, rocking back and forth in sorrow. He did not offer empty platitudes or try to quiet her. He simply sat on the ground beside her, a silent, steady presence, sharing the weight of her pain until the sun went down. Each of these moments was a revelation. This was the man she had begged to kill her quickly, this gentle, protective, compassionate man. The fear she had once felt for him had long since evaporated, but now something new and far more potent was taking its place. It was a deep, resonant ache in her chest, a longing that she did not have a name for. When he looked at her, she felt a warmth spread through her limbs. When he was gone from the camp on a hunt, she felt his absence like a missing part of the day. Her heart, which she thought had been shattered into pieces too small to ever mend, was beginning to feel again, and it was beginning to ache for him. Back in Verde Crossing, Elias Beckwith was consumed by a different kind of ache, a toxic mix of wounded pride and festering rage. The town's opinion of him had soured. He was seen as the man whose family had tried to trade a helpless girl to the Apache, a bargain that had failed spectacularly. The humiliation gnawed at him. He needed to reclaim his narrative, to recast himself as the victim, the hero. He spent days riding the foothills near the ranch, his whiskey-fueled obsession growing with each empty mile. He was looking for a body, for some sign that would prove the Apache had taken her and done away with her. Then, near the dry creek bed where Clara had first run, he found it. Snagged on a thorny mesquite bush was a tattered piece of fabric, a corner of the simple, faded apron she had worn every day. He snatched it from the branch, a triumphant, ugly grin spreading across his face. This was his proof. He rode into town like a man possessed, waving the scrap of cloth in the air. He burst into the sheriff's office, his voice booming with righteous fury. "They took her!" he yelled, slamming the apron piece down on the desk. "The Apache savages! They kidnapped Clara, and God knows what they've done to her. This is all that's left." The story spread through the town like wildfire. Elias, no longer the callous brute, was now the aggrieved brother figure, his family's honor besmirched. The town's simmering hostility toward the Apache boiled over. It was no longer about stolen cattle. It was about the sanctity of their women. That evening, a detachment of cavalry rode in from the fort, their blue uniforms a stark and ominous presence. The lieutenant, a young, ambitious man eager to make a name for himself, listened intently to Elias's fabricated tale of abduction and probable murder. The next morning, the soldiers were dispatched with a clear and brutal order: ride into the Apache territories and retrieve the white woman, by force if necessary. Clara knew nothing of the storm gathering beyond the canyon walls. Her world had become the small, enclosed space of the camp. Her inner turmoil, the only conflict she knew. One night, her past came for her in a dream. She was back in the canyon, the first canyon, standing before him in the twilight. She could feel the terror, the cold certainty of her own death. She heard her own voice. a pathetic whisper. "Please, make it quick." But in the dream, the memory sharpened. She saw the moment his eyes changed, the instant the hardness in his face fractured and was replaced by something else. She felt the impossible warmth of the blanket settling on her shoulders. He hadn't hurt her. He had seen her pain, and he had stopped. She woke with a choked sob, tears streaming down her face. The dream had stripped away the shame and humiliation, leaving only the raw, overwhelming truth of his kindness. He had saved her, not just from the desert, but from the absolute despair that had consumed her. The tears were not of fear, but of a gratitude so profound it felt like grief. A shadow fell over the entrance of the wickiup. Caton stood there, roused by the sound of her crying. He came and knelt beside her pallet of furs, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "A bad dream?" he asked, his voice soft. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She expected him to leave, to give her privacy. Instead, he reached out and, with a hesitation that spoke volumes, took her hand. His hand was warm and calloused, enveloping hers completely. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. Her first instinct, born of years of recoiling from unwanted touch, was to pull away. Her fingers trembled, but she fought the urge. She let her hand rest in his. It was a surrender, an act of trust more intimate than any words. He held her hand until her sobs quieted, until her breathing evened out, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the wickiup. The storm broke a few nights later. It came without warning, a violent, sudden onslaught. The wind howled through the canyon, tearing at the wickiups. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that echoed off the rock walls. Then came the rain, a torrential, driving downpour that turned the camp to mud in minutes. Clara had been caught outside, securing a loose hide on Nali's wickiup. She was soaked to the skin in seconds, her thin dress clinging to her, her hair plastered to her face. She huddled in the inadequate shelter of a rock overhang, shivering, the thunder vibrating through her entire body. Suddenly, a figure appeared through the curtain of rain. It was Caton. He said nothing, simply took her arm and pulled her toward the shelter of his own wickiup, which was larger and more protected. Inside, it was dark and surprisingly quiet, the roar of the storm muted by the thick brush walls. A small fire smoldered in the center, casting a warm, flickering glow. She stood shivering just inside the entrance, water dripping from her hair and clothes onto the dirt floor. Caton moved past her and returned with a heavy buffalo fur. He unfolded it and, standing before her, wrapped it around her shoulders. The fur was heavy and warm, instantly chasing away some of the chill. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His eyes, dark and intense, searched her face. The sound of the rain and the thunder faded into a distant roar. The world shrank to the small, fire-lit space of the wickiup, to the few inches of air that separated them. She could see the flicker of the fire reflected in his pupils. She could smell the rain on his skin, the scent of wood smoke in his hair. Her breath caught in her throat. His gaze dropped to her lips, then rose again to meet her eyes. A silent question hung in the air between them, charged and electric. The ache she had felt in her chest for weeks intensified, becoming a sharp, sweet pang of longing. He seemed to sense her inner turmoil, the flicker of fear that still lingered beneath her desire. His voice, when he spoke, was a low whisper, almost lost in the sound of the storm. "I will not touch you," he said, his words a solemn vow. "Not unless you ask me to." His promise was the final key, the one that unlocked the last of her fear. He was giving her the one thing that had been stolen from her, the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a choice. And in that moment, she chose. Slowly, she raised her hands and placed them on his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. Then, she leaned into him, rising on her toes. and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something far deeper. It was cautious, a tentative exploration. Her lips were soft and trembling against his. His were firm, hesitant. It was a kiss of gratitude, of reverence, of two broken souls finding a moment of quiet solace in a storm. It lasted only a moment, but it changed everything. She pulled back slowly, her eyes searching his. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The world outside raged on, and they both knew the danger they were in, the impossible chasm that separated their worlds. But inside the small, warm shelter, a fire had been lit. It was a small, fragile flame, but it burned with a fierce, undeniable heat, threatening to consume them both. The kiss in the storm-drenched wickiup was a threshold. In the days that followed, Clara knew she had crossed it and could never go back. The idea of leaving, of taking the stage to Prescott and disappearing into another life of quiet servitude, now seemed like a betrayal of the person she was becoming. She made a choice, not with words, but with her actions. She stayed. She woke with the sun, worked alongside Nolly and the other women, and learned the ways of the people who had given her sanctuary. Her life was no longer defined by four walls and the whims of a cruel mistress, but by the vast, open expanse of the canyon and the sky above it. She fell in love with the land itself, a fierce and unexpected passion. She learned to see it not as a barren wasteland, but as a place of subtle and resilient life. She learned which plants could be eaten, which roots held water, which leaves could be brewed into a tea to soothe a fever. The landscape was harsh, a canvas of red rock and thorny brush under a relentless sun. But it was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was, and in its raw, unforgiving beauty, Clara found a reflection of the strength she was discovering in herself. Her bond with Cayetan deepened in the quiet spaces of their days. It was a love that lived in shared glances across the fire, in the simple gesture of him bringing her a perfectly ripe prickly pear fruit, its thorns carefully removed. It was a language of presence, not of promises. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a place to rest. One night, when a full moon hung in the sky like a silver medallion, casting a ghostly light over the canyon, he came to her. He took her hand and led her away from the sleeping camp, up a narrow, hidden path she had never seen before. They walked in silence for nearly a mile, the only sound the soft scuff of their moccasins on the trail and the chirping of crickets. He brought her to a place that felt like a secret heart of the mountains. It was a small grotto, enclosed by high rock walls, where a spring trickled from a fissure in the stone, pooling into a basin of water so clear it reflected the stars above. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. It was a sanctuary. Cayetan turned to her, his face Yiban in shadow, Yiban bathed in moonlight. He slowly reached up and untied the leather thong that held her deerskin dress at the shoulder. The garment fell away, leaving her standing before him, her skin glowing in the ethereal light. There was no shame, no fear. In his eyes, she saw not possession, but a reverence that made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. She, in turn, helped him shed his own garments, her fingers tracing the old scars on his chest and back, each one a story she was beginning to learn. They waded into the pool together. The water was cool and silky, a shocking, delightful caress against their warm skin. Under the silent watch of the moon, they bathed, washing the dust of the day from each other's bodies. His touch was not rough or demanding, but exquisitely gentle, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. When he washed the dirt from her feet, his fingers tracing the tender, healed scars, a sob caught in her throat. No one had ever touched her with such care. In the still water of that hidden spring, their desire, which had smoldered beneath the surface for so long, finally ignited. He drew her close, her wet skin sliding against his. His mouth found hers, and this kiss was nothing like the first. It was deep and consuming, a raw expression of all the unspoken longing that had grown between them. It was a kiss that sealed her choice, that bound her to him in a way that no words or vows ever could. Their love was a quiet thing, but it was as powerful and elemental as the land itself, a force that had taken root in the most unlikely of soil and was now blooming in the darkness. A few days later, Nali approached her as she was mending a child's torn moccasin. She held out her hand, and in her palm lay a small, intricately carved bead made from deer antler. Tiny, geometric patterns had been etched into its surface with a master's skill. "This was my mother's," Nale said in the halting English she had been learning from Clara. "She gave it to me before she died. For family." She took Clara's hand and pressed the bead into her palm, closing her fingers around it. The gift was so much more than a simple object. It was acceptance. It was trust. It was a statement, clear and undeniable, that Clara belonged. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she looked at the younger woman, her heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it was painful. For the first time since her own parents had died, she felt the warmth of family, the solid ground of belonging. But in that harsh and unforgiving land, joy was a fleeting visitor. The peace of the canyon was shattered 2 evenings later. It began with the appearance of a lone rider, a man from a related band whose village lay a day's ride to the south. He was slumped over his horse, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder, his face a mask of horror. He fell from his saddle into Caton's arms, gasping out his story before he collapsed. Soldiers. They had come at dusk, without warning, without provocation. They had ridden into the village with their rifles firing, cutting down men, women, and children indiscriminately. They had set fire to the wickiups, burned the winter stores. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Throughout the night, a handful of other survivors trickled in, mostly women and children who had managed to escape into the brush. They brought with them tales of such horror that Clara felt her stomach clench with sickness. They were half mad with grief and terror, their bodies and spirits broken. Nali and the other women worked tirelessly, tending to wounds, comforting weeping children, and listening to the ghastly accounts. Clara moved among them in a daze, helping where she could, her hands shaking as she offered water to a woman who could not stop staring into the fire, her eyes empty of everything but the reflection of the flames that had consumed her home. A dreadful certainty began to dawn in Clara's mind. The soldiers were looking for someone. They were punishing the people who had given her shelter. This was because of her. The taste of ash filled her mouth. The small, fragile happiness she had found was built on a foundation of terrible danger to the very people who had saved her. The army was closing in. Her fears were confirmed the next day. A scout returned from the east with grim news. He had seen a large patrol of soldiers, led by a civilian, a white man who rode with a swagger and carried a bottle in his saddlebag. Elias. The scout had crept close enough to hear their talk. They were being led by the white man, who claimed that this band, Caton's band, had stolen his sister and were holding her against her will. He was telling them that the Apache were liars and murderers, and that the only way to get the girl back was to burn them out, to leave nothing but scorched earth. The news hit Clara like a physical blow. Elias, with his poisonous lies, had turned his personal vendetta into an act of war. He was using the United States Army as his own personal instrument of revenge. That night, a council was held. The men sat in a grim circle, their faces illuminated by the fire, their voices low and tense. The options were few and bleak. They could run, abandon the canyon and flee deeper into the mountains. But it was a hard journey, especially for the elders and the small children. And the soldiers were mounted and would be faster. Or they could stay and fight. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. Clara went to Caetan after the council had dispersed. She found him standing alone on a high ledge, staring out into the darkness. "We have to run," she said, her voice tight with panic. "They are coming for me. If I am gone, maybe they will leave you be." I can go. I can turn myself in. The thought of facing the soldiers, of being returned to the world that had discarded her, was terrifying. But the thought of these people dying for her was unbearable. Cayetan turned to look at her, his face like carved stone in the moonlight. And where would you go? Back to the man who hurt you? Back to the woman who sold you? His voice was quiet, but it held a core of unbendable steel. This is no longer just about you, Clara. They are not coming only for you. They are coming for the land. They have always been coming for the land. You are just the excuse they are using today. But the elders, the children, she pleaded. They cannot outrun the soldiers. No, he agreed. They cannot, which is why we will not run. We will not abandon our old ones to the wolves. We will slow the soldiers down. We will give our families time to move to a safer place, and we will make the soldiers pay for every step they take into this canyon. His decision was absolute, the calm, unshakable resolve of a leader who knew his duty. In that moment, Clara understood that his strength was not just in his skill as a warrior, but in his profound sense of responsibility to his people. He would die for them. The camp was a hive of frantic, controlled activity the next day. The women, led by Nali, packed what little they could carry: dried meat, water skins, blankets, and medicine bundles. The older children helped the younger ones, their faces strained with a premature gravity. An air of grim purpose replaced the initial panic. Cayetan and a small band of warriors, no more than a dozen men, prepared for the coming fight. They did not intend to meet the soldiers in open battle. That would be suicide. Instead, they would use the canyon itself as a weapon. They moved out, silent as ghosts, to set traps along the narrow trail that was the only entrance to their camp. Rockfalls that could be triggered from above. Thorny brush piled to block the path. Snares hidden in the undergrowth. They would bleed the soldiers, slow them, harass them from the rocks like angry spirits. The non-combatants began the exodus in the late afternoon, moving up a steep, treacherous path that led deeper into the mountains. It was a slow, agonizing procession. The elders had to be helped over the rocks, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Children cried with exhaustion and fear. The attack came just before dusk. The first distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, a sound that made Clara's blood run cold. It was followed by a volley, then another. The sounds of shouting, of horses screaming, drifted up from the canyon floor. Cayetan and his men had engaged them. Clara was helping an old woman navigate a particularly difficult stretch of the trail when a new sound pierced the chaos, the high, terrified scream of a child. She looked back and saw him. It was the little boy Cayetan had saved from the rattlesnake. He had tripped and fallen, and now he lay on an exposed ledge about 50 yards back, a dark stain spreading on his buckskin tunic. His mother was trying to get to him, but she was pinned down behind a rock by the sudden, terrifyingly close whistle of ricocheting bullets. The soldiers were advancing faster than expected, firing wildly into the rocks. Without thinking, Clara acted. She shoved the old woman into Nali's care and scrambled back down the trail. "Clara, no!" Nali screamed after her. But Clara did not hear her. Her world had narrowed to the small, crying figure on the ledge. She ran in a low crouch, the air alive with the sound of bullets smacking against the rocks around her. She could feel the vibrations through the soles of her moccasins. She reached the boy, her lungs burning. The wound was in his leg, a nasty gash from a bullet that had grazed him, and it was bleeding badly. He was hysterical with pain and fear. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress and quickly tied a tight tourniquet above the wound. Then she scooped him into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of terror. As she straightened up, a bullet sang past her ear, so close she felt its heat. She stumbled back, shielding the boy with her body, and began the desperate climb back to the others. She had just reached the relative safety of the main group when a warrior rose from the rocks beside her. It was Cayetan. His face was smeared with dirt and sweat. his eyes burning with a fierce, wild light. He had seen the whole thing. He looked at her, at the blood on her hands and dress, at the sobbing child in her arms. He reached out and took the boy from her, passing him to his waiting mother. Then he turned back to Clara. He took her hand, the one that was smeared with the child's blood. He lifted it to his lips and pressed a firm, reverent kiss into her palm. His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw a love and respect so profound it took her breath away. It was an anointing, a benediction in the midst of chaos. He had seen her not as a fragile creature to be protected, but as a warrior in her own right. He gave her hand a final squeeze. "Go," he commanded, his voice rough. "Get them to safety. I will follow." He turned and melted back into the rocks, the sounds of the battle calling him back. The flight into the mountains was a waking nightmare. They traveled through the night, a ragged line of fugitives under a cold, indifferent moon, when they finally stopped, high in a pine-choked ravine. They were miles from their home, exhausted and heartbroken. Kaitan and the last of his warriors joined them just before dawn, their faces grim, 2 of their number missing. They had slowed the soldiers, but they had not stopped them. They had only bought a little time. Clara found a spot away from the others, her body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. Kaitan came and sat beside her. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, drawing on his strength. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had lost, for the terror that lay ahead. As the exhausted camp finally fell into a fitful sleep, they lay side by side, his arms wrapped tightly around her. They held on to each other as if they might vanish into the cold mountain air. 2 small points of warmth against a vast and encroaching darkness. The high mountain ravine was a prison of wind and rock. The initial relief of escape had curdled into a slow, grinding despair. They had been there for weeks, trapped. The soldiers had not pursued them past the first few ridges, but they had effectively created a blockade, cutting them off from the lower hunting grounds. Food, once carefully rationed, was now nearly gone. The hunters returned with little more than a few rabbits or a scrawny squirrel, not enough to feed the elders and the growing number of listless, hungry children. A gnawing cold seeped into their bones, a chill that had less to do with the altitude than with the hopelessness that was beginning to settle over the small, beleaguered band. Then the storm came. It was not a rainstorm, but a wall of dust. A monstrous, churning cloud of red grit swept up from the desert floor by a furious wind. It descended on the ravine, blotting out the sun and turning the day to a suffocating twilight. The wind shrieked through the pines, a sound like a soul being torn apart. For 2 days, they huddled in whatever shelter they could find, their eyes and mouths full of grit. The world reduced to a roaring, abrasive darkness. When the wind finally died, it left behind a profound, unnervous silence. The landscape was changed, coated in a fine red dust that covered everything like a shroud. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological blow. The storm had sealed them in, triggering small rock slides that blocked the few remaining passable trails. They were cut off, truly and completely. The last embers of hope began to die. The camp grew quiet, the conversations dwindling to necessary murmurs. People moved with a slow, heavy listlessness, their eyes empty. Clara felt the despair as a physical weight in the air. She watched a mother try to soothe a hungry, crying baby, her own face a mask of gaunt exhaustion. She saw the proud, straight backs of the warriors begin to slump, and one evening, as she sat watching the last pale light fade from the sky, a sorrow so immense it felt bottomless washed over her. She began to weep. The tears came silently at first, then in great shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Kaitan, seeing her distress, came and sat beside her, but she could not be comforted. "It is not for me," she finally managed to choke out, her voice thick with tears. "It is for them, For the children, for the old ones, for everything they have lost. They saved me, and I have brought them nothing but this." Her grief was not for her own fear or her own hunger. It was for them, for this small, resilient family that had taken her in, and for the injustice that was slowly strangling them. In that moment, her heart broke open, not for her own past, but for their present. The aftermath of the storm brought a more immediate tragedy. A section of the ravine wall, destabilized by the wind and rain that had preceded the dust, gave way in a sudden, thunderous rock slide. It was a small slide, but Caton's father, Taza, was caught at the edge of it. He was a stern, quiet man who had watched Clara with deep suspicion since her arrival. A large boulder had crushed his leg, and the impact had thrown him against the cliff face, leaving a deep gash on his forehead. They carried him back to the camp, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Panic rippled through the group. Their healer was one of the men who had been lost in the first fight, while the other women knew some basic remedies. A wound this severe was beyond their knowledge. Clara, however, stepped forward. All the lessons she had absorbed from Nali, all the nights spent watching the women prepare poultices and teas, coalesced into a calm, focused purpose. She gently cleaned the head wound, her touch surprisingly steady. She brewed a strong tea from willow bark for the pain, holding the cup to the old man's lips herself. Then she turned her attention to the leg. It was a bad break, the bone clearly shattered. "It must be set," she said, her voice clear and firm, leaving no room for argument. "And splinted, or he will lose the leg, if he does not die from the fever first." Under her direction, the men brought straight, sturdy branches from a pine tree. Clara tore strips from her own deerskin dress for bindings. Setting the bone was an agonizing ordeal. Caton held his father's shoulders, his own face a mask of controlled anguish as Taza cried out in a raw, guttural voice. But Clara was resolute, her hands firm and sure as she forced the bones back into alignment. She worked through the night and into the next day, changing his dressings, forcing water and broth between his lips, her presence a constant, soothing vigil. Taza's fever broke on the third day. He woke to find Clara asleep on the ground by his side, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. He looked at her for a long time, his old, wary eyes seeing something new. Later that afternoon, Caton came to sit with him. "She did not leave my side," Taza said, his voice weak but clear. Caton nodded. "She has a strong spirit." "It is more than that," the old man said, his gaze intense. He looked at his son, his warrior son who had brought this strange, pale woman into their lives. "That girl, she was not weeping for herself the other night. She was weeping for us. She loves us like we are hers." The words were a profound declaration, a final, unequivocal acceptance. He had seen the truth of her heart, and he gave his blessing. But Taza's recovery did not change their desperate situation. A council was held, the mood grim. Surrender was now spoken of as an inevitability. "We have women and children who will not survive another week," said one of the warriors. "It is better to surrender and live as prisoners than to die of starvation on this mountain." "The soldiers do not take prisoners," Chato, the elder, countered, his voice grim. "They take scalps. A warrior's death is better than a dog's." The debate raged, a hopeless circle of bad options. They could die fighting, die starving, or die at the hands of the soldiers, as despair threatened to consume them all. Clara, who had been listening silently from the edge of the circle, stood up and walked into the firelight. "There is another way," she said. All eyes turned to her. Her voice, though quiet, was filled with a conviction that commanded their attention. "You cannot fight the soldiers. They have too many guns, too many men. You cannot fight the hunger, but you can fight the lie that brought them here." She looked at Caton, then at the faces around the fire. "The soldiers are here because of a story Elias told them. A lie about a kidnapping. If we can show the townspeople that it is a lie, if we can tell them the truth, maybe they will stop. The soldiers will not fight if the town turns against them. It was a desperate, audacious plan. To walk back into the lion's den, to trust in the conscience of a people who had shown them nothing but hatred. They will kill you before you speak a word, Chato scoffed. They will not see us, Caton said, his eyes fixed on Clara, a slow spark of understanding igniting in his gaze. He saw the brilliance of her plan. It was a warrior's strategy, but it used a different kind of weapon. He turned to the others. She is right. We have been fighting their battle, a battle of bullets. It is time to make them fight ours, a battle of truth. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they left, just the two of them. They moved through the broken mountain passes like ghosts, Caton's knowledge of the terrain guiding them through the darkness. For 2 days they traveled, eating little, sleeping less, driven by a fragile, desperate hope. They reached the outskirts of Verde Crossing late on the third night. The town was a collection of yellow, lighted squares in the vast darkness, a place that now seemed both alien and achingly familiar to Clara. They crept through the shadows, every dog's bark a thunderclap, every distant voice a threat. Their goal was the church, a simple wooden structure at the end of the main street. Its pastor, Reverend Miller, was a man Clara remembered as being stern but fair, his sermons often touching on themes of justice and mercy, ideas that seemed to be in short supply in the town he served. They found shelter in an old, abandoned blacksmith's forge near the edge of town, by the light of a stolen candle stub. Clara wrote. She had no proper paper, only a few torn, flyleaf pages from a hymn book she had found in the church earlier, and a piece of charcoal from the forge. Her hand, once accustomed to fine needlework, was now rough and calloused, but her words flowed with a fierce, simple clarity. She did not write a plea for mercy. She wrote a testament. She told of her arrival at the Beckwith Ranch, of the widow's cold cruelty, of Elias's constant torment, with a hand that trembled only slightly. She described the assault in the pantry, sparing no detail of his violence or her terror. She wrote of the bargain her mistress had struck, of being led to the canyon to be traded like livestock. She wrote of Caton's shocking act of mercy. I was not kidnapped by the Apache, she wrote, the charcoal scratching against the page. I was saved by them. I did not run with them. I ran from the house of a man who believes he has the right to own and abuse another human being. The people you call savages have shown me more kindness and honor than I have ever known in your civilized world. The man leading your soldiers is not a hero. He is a coward and a liar, and the war you are waging is built on his shame. She signed it simply. Clara. Their next task was to deliver it, but as they waited for the town to fall into a deeper sleep, Clara felt a pull, a piece of unfinished business. There is something I must do, she whispered to Caton. She led him through the back alleys of the town, her heart pounding, until they stood in the shadows behind the Beckwith Ranch house. A single lamp burned in the parlor. Clara picked up a small stone and threw it against the window pane of the widow's downstairs bedroom. A few moments later, a figure in a nightdress appeared at the back door, peering into the darkness. It was Mrs. Beckwith. Clara stepped out of the shadows. The widow gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Her face, in the pale moonlight, was a mask of disbelief and fear. You, she breathed. I am not dead, Clara said, her voice low and cold, devoid of the fear that had once defined her. She took a step closer, savoring the flicker of panic in the older woman's eyes. You tried to throw me away. You tried to have me erased, but I am still here. She paused, letting the words sink into the cold night air. You sold me once, never again. Without another word, she turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Mrs. Beckwith standing alone on the porch, trembling. It was not an act of revenge, but of reclamation. She had taken back her own story. An hour before dawn, they moved to the church. Caton created a small disturbance down the street, drawing the attention of the town's lone night watchman. While he was gone, Clara slipped onto the preacher's porch and pushed the folded pages under his door. Their part was done. Now, all they could do was wait and see if the seeds of truth would find fertile ground. They hid in the choir loft of the church, a dark, dusty space that gave them a clear view of the pews below. On Sunday morning, the townspeople filed in, their faces a mixture of piety and self-righteousness. Clara saw Elias and his mother take their usual place in the front pew. Elias looked smug, enjoying his role as the town's righteous victim. Mrs. Beckwith was pale, her face a rigid mask. Reverend Miller began his service, his voice heavy. He spoke of truth and of lies, of how a lie could poison the soul of a man and of a community. Then he paused. He pulled the charcoal-marked pages from his Bible. "Before I continue," he said, his voice ringing with a new, powerful authority, "a testimony has come into my possession, a testimony that speaks to the very soul of the matter that has consumed this town. I believe it is my duty before God to read it to you." A confused murmur swept through the congregation. The preacher began to read. As Clara's words filled the silent church, the atmosphere began to change. The self-righteous expressions were replaced by looks of shock, of disbelief, of dawning horror. Women glanced at each other, then at Elias. Their eyes narrowed. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When the preacher read the account of the assault, a collective gasp went through the room. Elias's face went from white to red, his knuckles white where he gripped the pew in front of him. The preacher finished, his voice trembling with emotion. He folded the pages. The silence in the church was absolute, a thick, ringing void. Then, the dam broke.
"Lies!"
a man shouted from the back.
"Apache tricks!"
"Make him answer for it!" a woman cried out, pointing a trembling finger at Elias.
"Is it true, Elias Beckwith? Did you do those things?"
The room erupted into a cacophony of accusations and denials. Elias jumped to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. His eyes, wild and cornered, scanned the room and found what they were looking for. He saw Clara, a shadow in the open door of the choir loft.
"There!"
he screamed, his voice cracking.
"The Apache whore! She's the liar! She is the one who has brought this on us!"
He was no longer thinking. He was a wild animal, trapped and lashing out. He pulled a small pistol from his coat pocket and lunged toward the stairs to the loft. His intention clear. People screamed and scrambled to get out of his way. But he never made it to the stairs. A figure dropped from the loft, landing silently on the church floor between Elias and Clara. It was Caton. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Before Elias could aim his weapon, Caton closed the distance. There was a brief, brutal struggle. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, splintering the floorboards. Caton disarmed Elias with a swift, painful twist of the wrist. Elias, screaming in rage, drew a knife. Caton sidestepped the wild slash and, with a precise, calculated movement, drove his own knife into Elias's shoulder, deep enough to disable but not to kill. Elias collapsed to the floor, howling in pain and shock, clutching his ruined shoulder. The townspeople stared, frozen in stunned silence. The soldiers who had been attending the service stood near the back, their hands on their weapons but looking utterly bewildered, their moral authority gone. The lines between good and evil hopelessly blurred. Caton stood over the whimpering form of Elias for a moment, his face hard, his chest heaving. Then he turned his back on him, a final act of dismissal. He walked to the stairs, where Clara was now standing, her face pale but her eyes steady. He held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. Together, they walked down the main aisle of the church. The townspeople parted for them, their faces a mixture of fear, awe, and a dawning, terrible shame. They did not look at anyone. They walked out of the church and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the main street, hand in hand, their backs straight, their heads held high. They walked away from the town that had wronged them, silent, proud, and unbowed. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the other. The fierce heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden light of autumn, and the sharp chill of winter gave way to a spring that painted the high desert with a fleeting, miraculous blush of wildflowers, a fragile peace, like the thin crust of ice on a morning water trough, settled over the territory. The story of what had happened in the church in Verde Crossing had traveled, carried by wagoneers and prospectors, becoming a strange and cautionary tale. An inspector from the U.S. Army had eventually arrived, a man with tired eyes and a low tolerance for hysterics. He interviewed the townsfolk, the shame-faced soldiers, and the tight-lipped Reverend Miller. He found the truth, or enough of it to see the rot at the core of the campaign. Elias Beckwith, still nursing a useless arm and a soul consumed by bitterness, was officially disgraced. The soldiers were quietly withdrawn from the foothills, their mission a source of embarrassment to their superiors. The war that was built on a lie had simply stopped. For Cayetan's people, it was not a victory, but a reprieve. They returned not to their old canyon, which now felt haunted by the violence that had torn through it, but to a new, more secluded home several valleys over. They remained hidden, sending out scouts, their trust in the white world shattered, but their spirit of survival unbroken. For Clara and Cayetan, peace took the shape of a home, near the secret spring, the sanctuary where their love had truly begun. They built a small dwelling. It was not a wickiup, nor was it a settler's cabin. It was something new, born of their two worlds. They made the bricks themselves, mixing mud from the spring with straw, leaving them to bake in the relentless sun. It was slow, laborious work. Clara's hands, which had once polished silver, now grew strong from mixing and lifting. Cayetan's powerful warriors' muscles were turned to the peaceful task of raising walls. Their house was small and sturdy, with thick adobe walls that kept it cool in the heat of the day and warm on the cold desert nights. It had a single room, a hearth for cooking, and a window that looked out over the grotto. They lived quietly, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the land. Cayetan hunted, but never more than they needed, his movements a prayer of respect for the animals that sustained them. Clara learned the patterns of the sun and the soil, and in a small, protected patch of earth near the spring, she began a garden. She coaxed life from the unforgiving ground with a patience she never knew she possessed. She planted corn and squash and beans, seeds that Nali had given her, and she tended to the small green shoots with a fierce, maternal devotion. This small patch of earth was hers. She had chosen it. She was putting down roots, not just for the plants, but for herself, in this quiet, sun-drenched space. She was no longer a servant, no longer a victim, no longer a shameful possession. She was a creator, a nurturer. She was home. Their love, which had been forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, softened. The frantic, clinging need to hold on to each other in the face of death was replaced by a deep, quiet companionship. It was a love that existed in the comfortable silences, in the easy way they moved around each other in their small home. It was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he had found on a hunt, or the way she would have a hot bowl of stew waiting for him when he returned, weary. At the end of the day, it was no longer about survival. It was about living. Nali was their most frequent visitor, a welcome bridge to the world of the camp. She would arrive with news, her face alight with the stories and gossip of their people. "They speak of you," she told Clara one afternoon as they sat shelling beans in the sun. "Some of the elders still do not understand, but the women, they understand. They say the white girl has the heart of an Apache." She also brought news from the town. gathered from traders and from the whispers that traveled on the wind. "Things are changing," she said, her expression thoughtful. "It is slow, like a river changing its course. But after the inspector came, some of the townspeople have begun to speak out. The preacher, Miller, he talks of your letter often. He says it was a stone dropped in a still pond. Some men in the town now say that we were wronged. They say Elias Beckwith is the only savage they have seen." The news was a small, warming ember in Clara's heart. It was not forgiveness, and it was not justice. Not yet, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of hatred, a sign that the truth they had risked everything for had not been in vain. Kaitan, too, was finding a new kind of peace, while the warrior in him remained ever watchful. The teacher and protector came to the fore. Sometimes a few of the older boys from the camp would come with Nali, their eyes wide with hero worship for the man who had faced down the soldiers. He would take them out, not to teach them to fight, but to teach them to live. He showed them how to read the stories left in the dust, the tracks of a deer, the passage of a coyote. He taught them which way the wind would blow by observing the hawks, how to find north by the stars. He was passing on the knowledge that had been given to him, ensuring that the soul of his people would endure. Clara would watch him with a group of boys, his voice low and patient, and her heart would feel so full it was as if it might burst. But the past was never truly gone. It lived in the scars on her skin and in the deeper, invisible scars on her soul. There were days when a sudden noise would make her jump, or a shadow falling the wrong way would send a cold spike of fear through her. She had been remade by this land and by this love, but the trembling girl she had once been was still a part of her. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple, Clara felt a familiar restlessness. She left the house and climbed the ridge that overlooked the grotto, the same path he had first led her down. She sat on a sun-warmed boulder, the same one where he had once stood guard, and looked out over the vast, beautiful, and brutal land that was now her home. She thought of the girl who had arrived in this territory, a frightened wisp of a thing, convinced she was worthless. She remembered the terror of the canyon, the feel of the cold ground beneath her knees as she prepared to die. She remembered whispering, "Please, make it quick." How small and broken she had been. She had believed that love was pain, that touch was a threat, that her only purpose was to endure the cruelty of others. A gentle sound behind her made her turn. Kaitan was there. He had followed her, his steps as silent as the evening air. He came and sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. She leaned into his familiar warmth, the solid, steady presence of him, a constant anchor in her world. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "You stopped," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the breeze. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "That night," she clarified, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "In the canyon, when I begged you to make it quick, you stopped." She turned her head, her eyes meeting his. The memory was no longer a source of shame, but the very foundation of everything that had come after. "That's when I fell in love with you. Not here, at the spring, not in the storm. It was then, in that moment, because you saw my pain, and you chose kindness." A profound tenderness softened the sharp lines of his face. He reached up with his free hand and gently traced the faint, silvery scar that remained on her cheekbone, a ghost of Elias's cruelty. He leaned in and pressed his lips to it, a kiss that was a prayer, an absolution. Then he kissed the corner of her eye, where a tear had begun to form. "You are still trembling, little fire," he murmured against her skin, his voice a low, soothing vibration. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own dark pools reflecting the starlight. "But now," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, "it is not from fear." And he was right. The trembling was still there, a fine, electric hum beneath her skin. But it was no longer the tremor of a terrified animal. It was the vibration of life, of a heart that had been broken and had healed stronger. It was the quivering of a flame, small but bright, that had refused to be extinguished. Later that night, they lay together on a bed of furs under the open sky, just outside their small home. The moon had not yet risen, and the Milky Way was a brilliant, shimmering river flowing across the infinite blackness. The air was cool, and the desert wind whispered through the rocks of the grotto, a sound that was no longer lonely, but was now the lullaby of their home. His skin was warm against hers, his arm a comforting weight across her body. She laid her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, a beat that had become the rhythm of her own life. This love, born of violence and despair, should never have been. It was a fragile, impossible thing, a wildflower blooming on a sheer rock face. It defied all logic, all rules, all the hatred of the world that lay just beyond their hidden canyon. And yet, it was the most real and powerful thing she had ever known. It burned brighter and warmer than any fire. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.